Before the Kray Twins ruled East London, there was a man in the South whose name made gangsters tremble. His methods were brutal, his influence unmatched. This is the story of Charlie Richardson, the man who brought fear, electricity, and blood to the London underworld. In post-war Britain, when London was still recovering from bombings, broken buildings, and hunger, a new kind of empire began to rise, not built on politics or business but on fear, loyalty, and control. In post-war Britain, when London was still recovering from bombings, broken buildings, and hunger, a new kind of empire began to rise, not built on politics or business but on fear, loyalty, and control. At the heart of it all stood one man, Charlie Richardson, a sharp, calculating figure who would soon turn South London into his personal kingdom. Charlie wasn't your typical gangster. He didn't grow up dreaming of fame or notoriety like many of the East End boys who idolized gangsters. He was quiet, intelligent, and dangerously strategic. Born into a working-class family, Charlie understood early that the streets were ruled by two things: money and muscle, and he was determined to master both. In the 1950s, while most men were working honest factory jobs, Charlie was already playing the game differently. He began by opening a series of scrap metal businesses, but these were far more than they appeared. Behind the clanging of iron and steel was a growing criminal network, fencing stolen goods, laundering money, and building alliances with corrupt businessmen, police officers, and local politicians. He wasn't running from the law, he was outsmarting it. Charlie's operations were designed like a corporation. Every man had a role. Every deal had paperwork. Every punishment was recorded and justified. He believed crime could be run like business and his empire would prove it. In a city split by class and power, Charlie's methods were revolutionary. While others fought with fists, he fought with strategy, contracts, leverage, and silence. His base of power was Camberwell, South London, a tough, working-class district filled with men who'd seen the war and didn't fear violence. To them, Charlie wasn't a gangster. He was a leader, a man who brought order to chaos. He offered protection to some, punishment to others, and opportunity to those willing to serve. If you were loyal, you were rewarded. If you betrayed him, you disappeared. By the early 1960s, Charlie's reach extended beyond the scrapyards. He had connections in construction, finance, and clubs. He was no longer the man collecting small-time debts. He was now influencing contracts, owning businesses, and controlling entire sectors of South London's underground economy. Where others saw crime, Charlie saw commerce. Where others saw gangs, he saw a brand. He didn't shout, didn't pose, didn't chase fame. His power was quiet, the kind of silence that makes men nervous. But power in Charlie's world came with an unspoken rule: it must be protected through fear. And no one embodied that rule more efficiently than the Richardson brothers, Charlie and his younger brother Eddie. Together, they became the core of what the press would later call the torture gang. Before the violence, before the electric wires and pliers that made them infamous, there was strategy. Charlie built a system, one that merged business efficiency with ruthless discipline. He recruited former soldiers, boxers, and ex-policemen, men who understood obedience. They weren't just thugs, they were employees. The Richardson Gang had meetings, uniforms, and codes of conduct. It was as if the army had gone underground, a corporation of crime. Charlie's rise wasn't just about control. It was about reputation. He understood that in the criminal world, fear was worth more than gold. He created an atmosphere where just the mention of his name could make grown men sweat. He didn't need to be everywhere. His reputation traveled faster than he did. And then came the South versus East divide, the unspoken rivalry that shaped the London underworld. While the Kray Twins were charming the celebrities of the East End, rubbing shoulders with movie stars, politicians, and boxers, the Richardsons were turning South London into a fortress of terror. Charlie didn't need fame, he had influence. He didn't need to be photographed with stars. He preferred to meet bankers and brokers who could move his money quietly. To the outside world, he was a businessman. To those inside his world, he was judge, jury, and executioner. The rise of the Richardson Empire was marked not by flashy displays, but by whispered warnings. Men disappeared without a trace. Businesses suddenly changed ownership. Rivals who refused to pay fees found their shops burned or their limbs broken. Yet strangely, many still respected Charlie because his rule had logic. If you obeyed, you thrived. If you crossed him, you paid. It was a system that made sense in a city built on survival. But behind the order was darkness. Charlie's version of business discipline was brutal. Punishments were designed not just to hurt, but to send messages. Every act of violence had a purpose: to maintain fear as a management tool. He believed pain was a form of currency, and the more it was spent, the stronger his empire grew. By now, even the police knew his name, but they struggled to touch him. His businesses looked legitimate, his employees were loyal, and his witnesses, silent. He was untouchable, hidden behind layers of legal protection and street loyalty. He drove expensive cars, wore tailored suits, and spoke with the calm authority of a CEO. He had turned organized crime into an organization, one that didn't need publicity or bloodshed in the streets to prove its strength. He didn't want to be feared by the poor, he wanted to be respected by the powerful. As the 1960s moved on, the Richardson name became synonymous with money, fear, and control. Charlie's empire stood as the southern counterweight to the Krays' eastern glamour. And while the tabloids adored the Krays for their charm and style, those who truly understood London's streets knew the truth. The most dangerous man wasn't in the East End under neon lights. He was in the South, behind an office desk, quietly building an empire that ran on silence, loyalty, and terror. By the early 1960s, the name Charlie Richardson had already become a quiet warning in the streets of South London. But what was about to come next would push that warning into legend and terror. It would transform a business-minded gangster into the architect of one of Britain's most feared criminal organizations, the infamous torture gang. It began subtly, not with blood, not with violence, but with discipline. Charlie believed fear was the purest form of control. Money could buy loyalty, but fear could keep it. And so, he began creating a system where violence wasn't random, it was calculated, designed, and theatrical. When someone crossed the Richardsons, it wasn't just punishment, it was a lesson. At first, those lessons were simple: a broken nose for an unpaid debt, a smashed car for late payments. But as Charlie's empire grew, so did his need to enforce respect. And soon, his methods crossed into the realm of nightmares. His headquarters, the so-called Richardson office, looked like a scrap metal yard from the outside, but inside, it became a chamber of brutal justice. The men who entered there for business meetings didn't always come out the same. Some didn't come out at all. The gang ran their discipline like a courtroom, with Charlie as judge, his men as executioners, and pain as the verdict. It wasn't just beating or shouting. Witnesses later told stories that sounded too horrific to believe. Men being electrocuted with car batteries, teeth ripped out with pliers, nails hammered through feet, and mock trials held while Charlie watched with a calm, businesslike expression. He didn't shout. He didn't rage. He simply nodded, like a man approving the completion of a job. For the Richardsons, fear was an instrument of order. It made sure no one stole, no one betrayed, no one ran. If you broke the rules, you were made an example. And the city began whispering stories, some true, some exaggerated, about the South London electric chair, about screams coming from the scrapyards at night, about men who vanished after daring to cheat the Richardsons. Charlie's gang included some of the most dangerous and loyal men in the business. His younger brother Eddie Richardson was his right hand, fierce, loyal, and completely committed to the cause. Then there was George Cornell, a name that would later connect their world to the Krays in blood. Cornell was the enforcer, a man whose calm cruelty became legend. Together, they formed a trinity of fear that kept South London under their control. But here's what made the torture gang so different from other criminal outfits. They didn't see themselves as gangsters. They saw themselves as business regulators. To them, torture wasn't chaos, it was policy. It was management. If someone owed money, they'd attend a meeting. If someone lied, they'd receive correction. They turned brutality into administration. Charlie even ran his tortures like an accountant runs books, organized, efficient, and coldly logical. There were no random acts of violence. Every strike, every shock, every broken bone had a purpose: to reinforce the system. To him, it wasn't cruelty, it was control. This strange sense of corporate-style discipline made the Richardsons stand apart from every other gang in Britain. The Krays were showmen, they wanted fame, photos, press. The Richardsons? They wanted fear to do their talking. In a world obsessed with headlines, Charlie's world thrived in silence. His enemies didn't shout his name, they whispered it. Even police officers feared to get too close. They'd heard the stories too, of the man tied to a chair and electrocuted until he confessed, of another made to dance barefoot on broken glass, of others stripped, beaten, and left unconscious while the gang calmly poured drinks nearby. These weren't just punishments, they were performances of terror. And yet, despite it all, Charlie maintained a strange code of civility. He believed in respect, not compassion but order. If you kept your word, you had nothing to fear. If you betrayed him, you were erased. That balance, loyalty rewarded, betrayal punished, made his organization terrifyingly effective. No one dared talk. No one dared testify. His meetings were said to feel like boardroom interrogations. Questions asked quietly, lies detected instantly, pain delivered clinically. Charlie didn't have to touch anyone. He had men who did that for him. He just watched, calm, silent, and commanding, while others screamed for mercy. But the torture gang wasn't built on sadism alone. Charlie's goal wasn't to be cruel, it was to maintain control. The torture was a message: this is what happens when you cross me. And it worked. For years, no one dared defy the Richardsons. South London was theirs, a realm of steel, blood, and silence. Meanwhile, their reputation began spreading beyond London. Criminals from other cities wanted to align with them. Police informants refused to talk. Even the Kray Twins, in their glittering East End clubs, knew that the Richardsons weren't to be underestimated. Where the Krays used fear with finesse, Charlie used it with precision. His violence wasn't for show, it was for effect. And soon that effect began to terrify not just the streets, but the authorities themselves. Because as the stories grew darker, the public began asking questions. Who were these men? What was really happening behind the locked doors of those South London offices? The whispers became rumors. The rumors became fear. And fear became power. But power built on fear is fragile, and cracks were already forming. Inside Charlie's empire, paranoia began to spread. Who could be trusted? Who might talk? Who might betray? Every face became suspicious. Every meeting a possible trap. The torture gang had built their empire on silence and pain. But the louder the screams grew, the more attention they attracted, from rivals, from the press, and most dangerously, from the law. And soon, that attention would bring the Richardson Empire to its knees. By the mid-1960s, London was a city split in two. Not by politics or class, but by fear. To the east stood the Kray Twins, Reggie and Ronnie, polished and photogenic, shaking hands with celebrities and boxers, drinking with politicians, smiling for the cameras. To the south stood Charlie Richardson and his brother Eddie, colder, quieter, more calculating, men who didn't chase fame, they manufactured control. And between these two empires lay an invisible line running through the River Thames, the border of terror. The Krays ruled with image. They built nightclubs like temples, Esmeralda's Barn, the Kentucky Club, where actors, singers, and gangsters mingled under chandeliers. Their power came from charm. Their violence, though real, was dressed in tuxedos and headlines. The Richardsons, by contrast, ran their world like an industrial machine: grease, sweat, and silence. Their money came from scrap metal, fraud, and extortion. No film stars. No champagne. Only business. One empire glittered, the other bled. Whispers spread through the pubs and betting shops. The Krays own the East, the Richardsons own the South. Cross either and you disappear. It was an unspoken arrangement, born of mutual awareness rather than peace. They didn't need to meet, their reputations met for them. But pride is a dangerous currency in the underworld, and both sides had plenty. The first real crack in the silent border came through a man named George Cornell. Cornell had once worked for the Richardsons, a trusted enforcer known for his icy calm. But the world of crime shifts like smoke, and soon Cornell found himself drifting toward the Krays circle. Loyalty in those days was worth less than survival. To Charlie, Cornell's move felt like betrayal. To Ronnie Kray, it was recruitment. To London, it was the spark that would ignite a gangland war. While the Krays appeared on newspaper covers, posing in their tailored suits, Charlie was growing irritated. The media adored the twins, painting them as stylish outlaws, London's own celebrities of crime. But to Richardson, they were amateurs basking in attention that brought nothing but police eyes. He despised their obsession with fame. To him, real power was quiet. Real fear had no photographs. Still, beneath his controlled demeanor, jealousy simmered. The Krays had taken the East End and turned it into theater. Charlie had taken the South and turned it into a fortress. Two different worlds, one built on applause, the other on screams. And London wasn't big enough for both. At the height of their reign, both groups began circling the same prey: clubs, protection rackets, black market deals. Their men would bump shoulders in bars, trade insults, sometimes fists. Each encounter was a test: whose name carried more weight in the room. In those moments, it wasn't about money, it was about reputation, the currency of power. Charlie's men sneered at the Krays' vanity, calling them the pretty boys from the East. The Krays mocked the Richardsons as scrapyard torturers. Two sides of the same city, two versions of fear. But fate would bring them face to face in the most violent of ways. On a cold night in 1966, George Cornell, the man who had once served the Richardsons and now worked for the Krays, walked into the Blind Beggar pub in Whitechapel. Ronnie Kray followed soon after. What happened next would become one of the most infamous moments in British gangland history. Ronnie pulled out a revolver and shot Cornell in the head in front of everyone. One cold bullet ended a man, but opened a feud between North and South that would stain London forever. To the public, it looked like another murder in a violent city. To Charlie Richardson it was personal. Cornell had been one of his own once, a brother turned rival, now a corpse in the Krays territory. It wasn't just a killing, it was a message. And messages in the underworld always demanded replies. Retaliation whispered through the streets, though no open war ever erupted. Both empires were too powerful, too watched, too proud to start a bloodbath. Yet every move from then on carried tension. The Krays boasting in nightclubs, the Richardsons plotting in back offices. Police informants said both sides were preparing for confrontation. Gangland gossip said London might soon burn. The city held its breath. In truth, Charlie had no desire to fight a public war. He believed the Krays would destroy themselves. Too much spotlight, too many cameras, too many enemies in suits and uniforms. He preferred to watch them climb higher, knowing the fall would be longer. But the rivalry ran deeper than business. It was cultural. The Krays represented celebrity crime, handsome villains shaking hands with stars. The Richardsons represented industrial crime, hidden brutality wrapped in business suits and silence. Two ideologies clashing under the same grey London sky. Behind closed doors, though, both sides mirrored each other more than they cared to admit. Both had family loyalty, both demanded obedience, both believed in fear as a tool of leadership. They were reflections distorted by ambition, each seeing in the other the version of themselves they hated most. As police pressure increased across the capital, detectives began to link every act of violence back to one of two names, Kray or Richardson. For the authorities, they were twin cancers growing on opposite sides of the river. For Londoners, they were myth and nightmare combined. But the difference was this. When the Krays walked into a room, cameras followed. When Charlie Richardson walked in, silence did. And in that silence was something far more dangerous than fame, certainty. The certainty that pain, if ordered, would follow. By 1966, the tension between East and South had transformed London's underworld into a chessboard of fear. Each move by one side forced a counter from the other. The Krays expanded into West End clubs. Charlie tightened his grip on the South's industrial rackets. Every newspaper headline about the Krays fed Charlie's hatred for publicity. Every whisper of the Richardsons' torture chambers fed the Krays' need to prove dominance. The rivalry wasn't fought with armies, it was fought with reputations, each story darker than the last. And though the two powers rarely met, their shadows stretched across the same city, overlapping, merging, suffocating everything between them. By the end of that year, London no longer belonged to its law or its people. It belonged to two families, two philosophies of crime, two empires destined to destroy themselves. The Krays ruled with charm. The Richardsons ruled with fear. And somewhere between the flash of a camera in the east and the spark of a car battery in the south, the legend of Britain's underworld was written in silence, blood, and electricity. By 1966, Charlie Richardson's empire had reached its peak. Money flowed. Fear ruled. Silence was law. But in the shadows of success, the cracks had already begun to form, thin, invisible fractures in an empire built on intimidation and loyalty. And like every empire forged in blood, it wasn't the enemy outside that destroyed it. It was the betrayal within. 4 years, Charlie had run his South London operations like a machine. Smooth, efficient, terrifyingly precise. But power breeds arrogance, and arrogance blinds even the sharpest minds. Inside the Richardson Gang, small rivalries began to grow. Some men felt underpaid. Others wanted more control. And in a world where loyalty was enforced through pain, a single frightened man could become the downfall of giants. It began as many tragedies do at a party. That night, in a Camberwell warehouse, the Richardson brothers hosted what was supposed to be a celebration. A mix of business and pleasure, their way of rewarding the crew for another successful year. But as the alcohol flowed and tempers loosened, something went wrong. Someone, to this day no one knows exactly who, tipped off the police. When the raid came, it wasn't just a small bust. It was a storm. Police stormed the warehouse and uncovered what newspapers would later call a chamber of horrors. Among the chaos, they found weapons, ledgers, stolen goods, and tools that matched chilling rumors already whispered across London. Pliers, electric wires, and blood-stained floors. It was the first time the brutality of the Richardson Empire was laid bare for the law to see. But it wasn't just the evidence that doomed them, it was the voices. Once the first man started talking, others followed. Former associates, terrified and desperate, turned informants. They told stories that sounded like scenes from a horror film. They spoke of men tied to chairs, of electricity coursing through flesh, of screams that no one dared interrupt. They spoke of Charlie Richardson sitting calmly, smoking a cigarette, watching punishment unfold like a courtroom verdict. And suddenly the silent empire had sound, the sound of witnesses breaking the code of fear. The press pounced on the story with hunger. Headlines screamed, "Torture gang exposed. South London's House of Horrors. Businessman turned sadist." Charlie Richardson, the man who had built an empire of discipline, became a national obsession overnight. The same calm that made him powerful now made him monstrous in the eyes of the public. The newspapers painted him as a villain who had turned London into his personal torture chamber. The myth of the torture gang was born and it spread like fire. When the trial opened, the courtroom became a theater. Crowds gathered outside the Old Bailey. Inside, photographers fought for space while journalists scribbled every word, every gesture, every reaction. Charlie sat in his suit, expressionless, no emotion, no fear, no regret. Around him sat his men, some loyal, others visibly broken. It was the fall of the empire, staged for all of Britain to see. The witnesses, one after another, told stories that made jurors pale. They described mock trials where men were forced to confess their mistakes before being beaten. They spoke of electric shocks delivered by car batteries, of pliers used to tear flesh, of hammers swung in judgment. They spoke of fake hangings, of Charlie's voice echoing the words, "We'll give you a taste of justice." The defense tried to argue it was all exaggeration, tales spun by cowards and traitors. But the evidence spoke louder than words. Tools stained with blood. Burn marks on victims. Ledgers detailing debts settled. It was no longer rumor. It was record. The trial dragged on for weeks, gripping the entire country. Reporters called it Britain's most shocking criminal case. To the world, Charlie Richardson had become the embodiment of cold, organized evil. A man who ran his empire like a corporation of pain. And yet, through it all, he sat calm and composed, as if still in charge, as if the courtroom itself were just another one of his meetings. The prosecution called him a man who treated torture as business policy. The judge, stunned by the cruelty, said he had never seen such deliberate sadism in peacetime. Charlie listened motionless. But beneath the surface, his empire was disintegrating. His brother Eddie fought to hold their defense together, insisting it was all fabricated, that the Richardsons were being made scapegoats by a police force desperate to show results against organized crime. Some of their old allies in law and politics suddenly vanished. Doors once open were now locked. No one wanted to be connected to the torture gang. And then came the verdict. Guilty. Charlie Richardson was sentenced to 25 years in prison, one of the longest sentences ever given to a non-murderer at that time. His brother Eddie received 10 years. Others got less, but none escaped unscarred. In one judgment, the empire that had ruled South London through fear collapsed completely. As he was led away, reporters shouted questions. Charlie didn't respond. He just gave a faint, knowing smile, the same cold, businesslike expression he had always worn. To him, this wasn't the end of the war. It was simply another negotiation, one with the system itself. Outside the court, London exhaled. The reign of the Richardsons was over. But the story didn't fade. In pubs and alleyways, people still whispered about the torture rooms, the car batteries, the silent boss who ran London's underworld like a company of pain. The press had made their villain. The city had found its dark reflection. And somewhere behind prison walls, Charlie Richardson, the businessman of fear, was already planning his next move. When the iron doors of the prison slammed shut behind Charlie Richardson, most believed that was the end of his story. A man who had once ruled South London through terror was now reduced to a number, another inmate in a gray uniform, locked away from the empire he built. But those who truly knew Charlie understood one thing. He wasn't a man who broke easily. Prison didn't end his reign, it simply changed the walls around it. Charlie arrived in prison in 1967, carrying with him a reputation that reached the gates long before he did. Officers whispered his name, inmates stared in silence. This wasn't some petty criminal or loudmouth thug. This was the man the newspapers called Britain's most feared businessman. The man whose calm had unnerved judges and whose name had silenced entire neighborhoods. In his first few weeks, Charlie observed. He didn't talk much, didn't show emotion. He studied the system, the routines, the guards, the hierarchy among inmates. Where others saw punishment, Charlie saw structure. He adapted quickly, turning the environment that was meant to cage him into something he could control. Inside, power wasn't about fists, it was about influence. And influence was something Charlie Richardson understood better than anyone. He began offering advice to inmates, on money, on behavior, even on negotiation with wardens. He became a quiet authority the same way he had ruled the streets, not through shouting but through presence. He understood that even behind bars order could be built. Guards described him as polite, measured, and eerily calm. He didn't boast, didn't complain. He treated imprisonment like a long business meeting, something to be endured, analyzed, and eventually overcome. When other inmates raged or broke down, Charlie would simply smile and say, "It's just another kind of office, isn't it?" Over time, his influence spread. He managed to establish small systems of exchange, favors, connections, quiet deals that made life easier for those around him. He wasn't just surviving prison, he was managing it. But beneath the composure, Charlie was still haunted by betrayal. Men he trusted had turned against him in court, and their testimonies had destroyed his empire. Now, in a place built on punishment, he had nothing but time to think, to plan, to remember. He never showed regret for his actions, but he often spoke about loyalty, how it could build empires and how, once lost, it could destroy everything. He spent long hours writing letters, not desperate pleas for freedom, but detailed notes about his trial, his business, and his theories on control. Those who read them said they were written like corporate documents, not personal reflections. Charlie wasn't trying to prove his innocence, he was documenting his method. To him, what happened wasn't failure. It was evolution. His brother Eddie Richardson, serving time in another prison, remained loyal. The two communicated through coded letters and intermediaries. Even separated, they maintained the same disciplined relationship that had made them powerful. One as strategist, the other as executor. The world had labeled them monsters, but to each other they were simply partners in business, temporarily interrupted. Despite the brutality of his past, many inmates respected Charlie. He didn't bully. He didn't boast. He believed in respect through structure. You earned his approval by discipline, not fear. And so, within the cold walls of confinement, he built a smaller, quieter version of his empire. One based not on violence but on control through intellect and patience. However, not everyone admired him. Some guards saw him as manipulative, a man who could twist even punishment into advantage. They watched him carefully, but he never gave them reason for discipline. Charlie followed the rules meticulously, as if playing a game he intended to win on a technicality. He knew how systems worked, and prison, after all, was just another system. But what no system could take from him was his mind. He read voraciously, books on psychology, business, and law. He studied how corporations functioned, how leaders maintained authority, how governments controlled societies. To Charlie, crime had always been about one thing: power through order. And prison, ironically, was the perfect environment to study it. Outside, the world was changing. The Kray Twins, once his rivals, had now been arrested too. The empire of the East had fallen just as the empire of the South had. London's criminal underworld was shifting, and for the first time Charlie and the Krays shared something: a cage and a legacy. Some newspapers later claimed that Charlie and the Krays exchanged letters while inside. Whether true or not, it symbolized something poetic. Two empires that had mirrored each other in life now trapped within the same system they once defied. The kings of London reduced to inmates. But Charlie's imprisonment didn't erase his influence. Even behind bars, people on the outside still spoke his name. Old allies kept his businesses alive in fragments. Others feared to cross his family, knowing that freedom for Charlie was only a matter of time. Rumors spread that he still called shots from within, that money still moved, debt still got settled. Nothing was proven, but the myth lived on. In interviews years later, when asked about those years, Charlie would smirk slightly and say, "Prison's not the end. It's just another kind of classroom." And in a way it was. While others crumbled under isolation, Charlie evolved, studying people, systems, and patience itself. He learned to wait. He learned that true power isn't noise, it's endurance. And in that endurance, Charlie Richardson remained dangerous, even without a weapon, even without an empire. Because power, once learned, can't be caged. It simply waits, quietly, patiently, for the next opportunity. And behind those thick walls of stone and steel, the man the world called Britain's torture king was still thinking, still planning, still watching. Because even behind bars, Charlie Richardson was never truly imprisoned. By the late 1960s, London's underworld was collapsing in on itself. Two empires that had once ruled opposite sides of the River Thames, the Kray Twins in the east and the Richardson brothers in the south, were both under siege. Police raids, court trials, and public outrage had cracked the criminal code of silence that once protected men like them. But even as both families faced destruction, there was a difference, a subtle but defining line between the two. The Krays sought fame, Charlie Richardson sought control. The Krays loved the camera, the press, the glamour of London nightlife. Charlie? He preferred the silence of power, the kind that didn't need a spotlight. He built systems, not stories. That difference became clearer as both empires began to fall. When the Krays were arrested in 1968 for murder, the city gasped. Their downfall was front-page news. Paparazzi flashed cameras, journalists wrote dramatic headlines, "The Fall of the Kray Empire." Meanwhile, in a prison cell miles away, Charlie Richardson simply watched. His own empire had fallen a year earlier, his name already sealed in infamy. But unlike the Krays, Charlie didn't feed on fame. He studied the collapse like a strategist observing a rival's mistake. "They wanted to be legends," he once said quietly. "But legends don't last. Systems do." The Krays empire had been built on charisma and fear. Charlie's on efficiency and discipline. Both were brutal, but Charlie's methods carried a kind of twisted logic, a business structure for crime. He ran his operations like a company with rules, hierarchy, and even punishment policies. The Krays ran theirs like a theater, all performance and reputation. When the applause ended, so did their power. By the 1970s, the Krays were serving life sentences, their names now mythologized in books and newspapers. But within South London's backstreets, the Richardson name still carried a whisper of dread. Not because of fame, but because of memory. People still spoke of the electric chair, the mock trials, and the cold, organized cruelty that had defined Charlie's rule. It wasn't rage that terrified people, it was control. Charlie had shown the underworld that brutality didn't need chaos. It could be delivered with calm precision. When journalists tried to compare the two empires, old gangland figures often said, "The Krays might kill you for respect. The Richardsons would torture you for disobedience." That single sentence captured the psychological difference. The Krays sought status. Charlie demanded order. And that order, even in Charlie's absence, lingered. When he was behind bars, his old associates still operated in smaller circles. Disciplined, cautious, unemotional. They mimicked his methods, enforcing deals quietly, keeping their names off headlines. It was as though Charlie's ghost continued running South London from within the shadows. Meanwhile, the Krays world became entertainment. Movies, interviews, and autobiographies glamorized their story. Twin brothers turned gangland icons. But in those same interviews, when asked about the Richardsons, even the Krays showed a hint of respect and unease. Because they knew what Charlie represented. The kind of mind that could build an empire without ever needing to be seen. To many in law enforcement, the Krays were symbols of corruption in plain sight, flashy, arrogant, easy to follow. Charlie Richardson, on the other hand, was something far more dangerous. A businessman who understood crime as an institution. He blurred the line between the corporate and the criminal, creating a structure that the police couldn't easily dismantle. When his empire finally fell, they didn't just arrest men, they dismantled an entire system of control. But even in defeat, Charlie's legacy didn't die. In the decades that followed, countless London gangs borrowed from his blueprint. The discipline, the hierarchy, the loyalty codes, all came from the Richardson model. You could find echoes of his system in the way modern organized crime handled debts, punishment, and silence. Charlie had effectively rewritten the rules of organized brutality. He once told an interviewer, "I wasn't running a gang. I was running a business. It just didn't have a legal license." And that single sentence became the defining difference between him and the Krays. Where the twins represented emotion and showmanship, Charlie represented calculation. He had no time for fame, only results. As the years passed, the world began to romanticize the Krays, their sharp suits, celebrity friends, and tragic downfall. But the Richardsons? They remained the darker mirror, less glamour, more fear. Their story wasn't cinematic, it was clinical. It wasn't a tale of tragic heroes, it was a study in organized cruelty. By the 1980s, when Charlie was released, the underworld he once ruled had changed. The East End had lost its old codes. New gangs, new drugs, new rules. But even then, older criminals still spoke his name with a kind of reverence. Charlie Richardson, the man who ran South London like a company. His methods had become lessons whispered in pubs, his name a symbol of power that didn't shout, it commanded. In documentaries, former detectives would admit, the Krays gave us headlines. The Richardsons gave us nightmares. Because the difference wasn't just in violence. It was in intention. The Krays killed to send a message, Charlie punished to teach one. And in that difference lies the reason his legend has outlived even the myths of the East End. Today, decades later, when people speak of the golden age of London crime, the spotlight often shines on the Krays. But the shadow that still stretches quietly behind that light belongs to Charlie Richardson. The man who didn't seek fame, only control. A man who turned torture into order and fear into structure. A man who showed London that discipline could be deadlier than rage. And though both empires fell, it was Charlie's cold, calculating silence that outlasted the noise. Because in the end, when the lights faded and the crowds forgot, one truth remained. The Krays ruled the headlines. But Charlie Richardson ruled the streets. When Charlie Richardson finally walked out of prison after more than a decade behind bars, the world he had once ruled no longer existed. The smoky backrooms of South London clubs had turned into modern offices. The men who once spoke his name in fear were now gray-haired, scattered, or gone. The streets that had once pulsed with the rhythm of his authority were now unrecognizable. But even then, even as time erased the scars of his empire, his name carried weight. Not the loud, theatrical fame of the Krays, but the quiet respect reserved for those who changed the game. Charlie was older now, calmer. Yet, behind those cold blue eyes, there was still something unbroken, that same disciplined control that had defined his life. He didn't speak much about the past, and when he did, it was never with regret, only analysis. To him, everything that had happened was part of a structure. Success, failure, imprisonment, all different chapters of the same manual on power and consequence. When reporters tried to provoke him with questions about torture or violence, Charlie would pause, lean back and say softly, "Stories grow with time. Fear makes good headlines. But I was never in the business of stories, I was in the business of control." That single sentence summed up his philosophy. He never admitted guilt in the way the world expected. To Charlie, the past wasn't something to confess, it was something to understand. He believed society was built on the same rules he had lived by: discipline, hierarchy, punishment, and reward. He had simply operated outside the law, using the same structure that governments and corporations used within it. Yet something in him had changed. Years in confinement had forced him to see life differently. He began to write, to give interviews, to share his version of events, not to glorify crime but to redefine how people remembered it. He presented himself not as a villain, but as a businessman caught between two worlds, the corporate and the criminal. And while many disagreed, there was something magnetic about his calm reasoning. Even his critics admitted, Charlie Richardson made crime sound like management. But behind the interviews and the calm words, there was still the shadow, the legend of the torture gang. No matter how much time passed, that name followed him. People whispered about electric shocks, mock trials, teeth being pulled with pliers, horrific stories that turned his name into something almost mythological. And Charlie, ever the strategist, never fully denied it. He knew myth was its own kind of power. By keeping some truth hidden, he ensured his story would never die. In his later years, Charlie lived quietly. He ran small businesses, spoke at community events, and even became something of a local legend, the last relic of a vanished London. He didn't flaunt wealth or fame. He lived with purpose, almost like a man studying his own history from a distance. You could find him sitting alone in cafes in Croydon or Battersea, reading newspapers, watching the world he once ruled now run by rules he had broken. People who met him in his old age described him as sharp, polite, even philosophical. He rarely raised his voice. He spoke of loyalty, discipline, and control, the same values that had once built his empire, now redefined as lessons in life. But every now and then, when someone mentioned the old days, his eyes would flicker, that flash of cold steel, the silent reminder that beneath the calm exterior still lived the man who once made South London tremble. As he grew older, documentaries and books began to revisit his story. The Krays had become pop culture icons. Movies, tattoos, fan clubs. Charlie Richardson, however, became the darker legend. The intellectual gangster, the man who treated crime like an art of organization. You couldn't fully hate him, but you couldn't admire him either. He existed somewhere in between, feared, respected, and endlessly studied. In interviews from the 1990s and early 2000s, he often said he was done with the old life. But when pressed about whether he regretted it, his answer remained as cold and calculated as ever. Regret? No. I regret getting caught, not what I built. Everyone builds something. Mine just didn't have planning permission. It was that mix of humor, arrogance, and intellect that defined him until the end. Charlie Richardson never saw himself as a criminal, he saw himself as a constructor. A man who built order out of chaos, even if that order came through fear. And perhaps that's why his legacy feels so different from others. He wasn't about violence for its own sake. He was about power, about the art of controlling men, systems, and silence. When he passed away in 2012, the underworld didn't celebrate, it fell silent. For those who remembered him, his death wasn't just the end of a man, but the final chapter of an era, the end of the disciplined gangster. He had lived through the rise and fall of the Krays, the changing face of London, and the slow death of old-school organized crime. And yet, his name still felt dangerous to say out loud. Because Charlie Richardson wasn't just a man, he was a lesson. A lesson in what power really means. It's not the flash of violence or the noise of fame, it's the ability to stay calm when everyone else is afraid. It's the silence after chaos, the discipline behind cruelty, the logic behind madness. Today, when historians and crime writers look back at London's criminal past, they often end with the same reflection. The Krays may have owned the spotlight, but Charlie Richardson owned the silence. And in that silence, that cold, calculated stillness, lived the true face of power. Charlie Richardson, the man who built fear like an empire and ran it like a business, left behind more than a story. He left behind a blueprint. A code of control that decades later, still lingers in the shadows of South London streets. Because men like Charlie don't truly die, they fade into legend. And legends, no matter how dark, have a way of whispering through history forever.